building an indie business in the center of venture capital. I'm Alex Edmonds, and this is the Building an Indie Business podcast. Dun dun. Okay. Today I wanted to discuss metrics and specifically one metric, time spent listening. And I'm going to go over why that is a better metric than downloads, how to find this metric, what can you do with this information, why it's important, what can be done to get this to be a more common metric, and problems with it. Okay. Before we get into it, I wanted to discuss the survey I have. So, last week I announced a survey for the podcast, and it's just to get an idea of what you guys like to hear on the podcast and what you guys want to hear. So, you can tell me anything that's missing from the podcast or any episode ideas that you want to hear from me, and I will do an episode on them later. So I will put a link to that in the show notes. Okay, so let's get into it. Why is time spent listening a better metric than downloads? Because first of all, downloads is a vanity metric. It's not accurate. So a podcast counts as downloaded when it just goes into someone's podcast app. It doesn't actually measure if someone actually listened to the podcast episode. Time spent listening actually measures if people are listening. So it'll take the average of all the listens that your podcast or the podcast episode has, and it will create an average out of that. So if your 3-hour podcast is downloaded 100 times, but the time spent listening is 10 minutes, people aren't listening to your podcast, and downloads will not tell you that. So how can you find this metric? Well, it's not a standard metric, so you have to go to each individual platform, and it will show you your time spent listening per platform. So you go to Apple Analytics, you have to go to Spotify, Stitcher has this also, and all the others. Okay, what can you do with this information? The first thing you can do is you can place things you need people to hear based on your time spent listening. So let's say your podcast is 20 minutes and people stop listening after 10 minutes, and you definitely want people to hear that you want people to rate and subscribe to your podcast. Put that at the beginning. Don't put it at the end. If you have advertisers, you can charge more based on your time spent listening. So again, if you have a 20-minute podcast and people only listen to 10 minutes, charge your advertisers more for the first 10 minutes. If people are leaving early, figure out how to catch their attention before they leave. So if people are leaving after 5 minutes in your 20-minute podcast, figure out a way to get them to stay for longer. Have an attention grabber, have like a cliffhanger, something that makes them want to stay. The next thing you could do is send out a survey. Create a survey, ask people why they're leaving, ask them why, what can get them to stay, and then change those things around for your podcast. Okay. The final thing that you can do is ask for reviews. And what these reviews will do is the people will say, oh, this podcast is great, but I can only listen to half of it because ... And then you can fix your podcast based on what they say. It's kind of like the survey, but a little different. Okay. So, why is this important? Well, the very first reason why it's important is because it shows how underdeveloped the podcast industry is. It's a common metric on other platforms. On YouTube, it's called average view duration. And I'll get into YouTube a little later and talk about time spent listening on YouTube. Okay. The next reason why this is important is because it's a metric that can help podcasters improve their content. Okay. What can be done? How can we get time spent listening to be a standard metric in the podcast industry? Okay. One thing you can do is contact your podcast host and ask to include the metric in your podcast analytics. The next thing you can do is get podcasting news sources to write about it. By getting podcasting news sources to write about time spent listening, podcast hosts will see that people want this metric and they will figure out a way to provide this metric. Okay. Just talk about it. It'll create chatter about the metric, and it'll news sources will write about it, and then podcast hosts will read it, and then they'll figure out a way to include it. The next thing you can do is ask venture capitalists for a bunch of money to create the solution yourself. Yeah, right. Okay. So why downloads is used instead of time spent listening? Well, the first thing is because downloads is easy to track. It just every time the RSS feed is hit, then someone downloaded your podcast. The next reason why downloads is used is because it's an easy standard. If there's a 10-minute podcast and there's a 3-hour podcast, they have different time spent listenings no matter what. So it's kind of hard to track which one is the better podcast based on time spent listening. Okay. Problems with time spent listening. The first problem is that it gives you an average number. 33% of your listeners finished 99% of your podcast. Okay, so it would be kind of hard to track the changes in the time spent listening because if you have a lot of listeners, a new episode might not change your time spent listening so much. So if the episode is bad and people turn it off sooner, you might not be able to see that. Another problem, which I kind of already went over, is that it's not a standard metric, and you have to go to individual platforms to check out this metric. So it's kind of hard to track because each platform may have a very different time spent listening. So your time spent listening on Apple might be 5 minutes, Spotify 7 minutes, Stitcher 10 minutes, and so it's kind of hard to gauge whether people are listening. Okay. It'd be difficult to implement because of RSS. So RSS, the downloads are pinged. It'll ping the RSS feed, and that's how it's tracked. So it's one ping. With time spent listening, the RSS feed will have to be pinged the entire time someone is listening. So that would be hard to change because that's very different from how RSS works right now. Okay. So what's a better solution, or how can you track this right now? I would do overall downloads plus time spent listening. So you have 100 listens and 33% of your listeners finish 99% of your podcast, well, you have 33 listeners, not 100. Okay. That's it for now. Thank you for listening. If you are interested in hosting your own episode of the Open Podcast Community Podcast, come to the Telegram chat, which will be linked to in the show notes, and I can help you with that. The advantage of the Open Podcast Community Podcast is that you don't have to go through the hassle of setting up a podcast. I've already done that. You just need to send me the audio file and tell me what you want in the show notes, and I'll launch it to the Open Podcast Community Podcast. And I can post a link to the podcast in the show notes because it's now released. I have released 3 episodes. So the trailer, my episode about the Open Podcast Community Podcast, and an episode where I interview Brendan Weinstein. Okay. Thank you for listening. Have a nice day. Bye.